I just like that song. It's like out of respect, I just gotta let it play all the way out on behalf of Tupac. Good morning. Uh, Today is July 29th, 2020. This is Urban Talk Radio 103.5 FM, where you will hear conversation, information, education, inspiration, motivation from the American urban perspective. On the show today, I have a long-time friend and mentor, Paul Bass, is going to join me on the show today. He is in the Zoom studio of WNHH, and we are going to be talking about police and politics. You know, they always say at the dinner table, don't talk about politics. They say race and religion. But today we'll leave religion off. We're going to talk about the other two. The hotly debated police bill was voted on actually early this morning. I stayed up all night watching it, and we're going to be discussing that and some reactions. Also, we have a call-in number, so you can actually call in. We'll take questions, not comments. It's your own show to do your own comments, but we will definitely take questions and address that. We will not get into the technicalities of the bill because there are going to be enough people talking about that. We're just going to talk about the practicality of how do we move forward in urban America, given all the things that are happening right now in modern day policing. And I'll add my insights and expertise to this. You can join this conversation on Facebook at Bold Minds or at Twitter at Bold Minds. And you can also stream this show live on your smartphone by logging on to newhavenindependent.org. Paul, good morning.
Good morning, Shafiq. What an honor to be on with you. Great to see
Oh, man,
you.
I love it, man. I knew you before when I was in the as they say now, in the trenches, and also knew you throughout my entire career. And now it appears that this bill has passed. Did you watch it last night?
No, but I was editing the story this morning. Pretty much a party line vote. All the Republicans voted against this bill to rein in police misbehavior and identify cops who are loose cannons. All the Democrats but one voted for it. And the Republicans made it clear this is going to be a campaign issue in the fall. It's going to be played out at the polls in Connecticut in the fall.
So I brought you on the show today because, if I bring the senator on, then I've got to bring on somebody on the other side to keep the show balanced. If I bring on somebody that's an activist, then I've got to bring on the other side, obviously somebody that's a police union president, etc. But since I was a police officer, I retired and I did work in the police union. I do understand both sides, and I do sit on the task force for police accountability at the state of Connecticut. So we have been working, or I'm tasked now with inside of this bill with very specific things and some things that I've actually contributed to the bill in terms of some insight. So what I want to do this morning, Paul, is kind of switch the role. And I guess you would say both of us now as private citizens, right? But
Yeah.
you normally have like really kind of like keenness. I mean, like, hey, listen, we cannot ignore that there has been somewhat of a parallel being drawn between the Black Lives Matter movement, defund the police, and the backlash of the increased violence within African American communities. So depending on who you talk to, right, and I just go with some of the people I talk to, many African Americans say, no, that has nothing to do with the violence in the African American community. These things have been happening. The violence is actually part of the systemic racism and poverty and some of the other issues, which I would say as a Black person, exactly right. However, looking at it in the background as a former police officer, that some of these spikes in crime, certainly seem to be the result of a lack of attention being paid in particular areas of different cities throughout the United States. And then, of course, the media, which you are a media person, seems like the national media is finding every Black person shot in America and going, right to the front page with it. 1-year-old shot in New York, 1-year-old shot in Canton, Ohio. I mean, you name it. So, I mean, what do you think? Where are we going with this?
I think we're not really at this point addressing some of the core issues, which is what we want our police to be and how we want to be policed. So I think basically the Black Lives Matter movement, biggest protest movement in our country's history, with the really basic idea that for 5 minutes, almost all of America, except for the Trump White House, embraced, which is that Black Lives Matter. It doesn't mean other lives don't matter. It means they've been devalued and that we want to have racial justice. Let's work on the details. We knew there was going to be a counter charge against that. So savvy politicians tried to seize the moment. Andrew Cuomo in New York said, this is the only 5 minutes I'll ever be able to change state law so that police files of misdeeds can be released to the public. He knew there was only going to be that little window. Last night in New Haven, we had our window. State Senator Gary Winfield had a bunch of, I think, what kind of common sense police reforms, and that he couldn't get them past the legislature that's dominated by suburbs because of the Black Lives Matter moment, which I would argue in the political arena might be slipping. He got this stuff over the line just barely last night. So I don't think those are going to address the fundamental issues. I think there's some good reforms like having 5-year checks of police mental health, banning chokeholds in most cases. The one that was most controversial, lawsuits in state court, I thought people kind of missed the point because even if you can file a state lawsuit, most of the time the jury, of which the pool is mostly suburbanites, goes with cops. We've covered federal cases where police have done things clearly wrong. They usually win anyway. But there are more fundamental questions that I think we need to be sympathetic to both police officers and people in communities who've been abused by police. These are horrible times for police officers, as you know better than I do, most of whom are really good people trying to help the community and being treated as enemies. They go to, in New Haven in the recent weeks, they go to save someone's life and they're being taunted while they're doing it and prevented. And, a Black community that historically the rest of the society now gets to see it because of video, that there's so much brain idea. You've written the book on it. Every Black parent to tell their kid, you might be killed for doing nothing wrong because you're Black, because of the way policing is done in the society. So I'm thinking what are going to be the big changes? I think because there's been an uptick in crime, and remember, we have our lowest violent crime in New Haven that we've had in yours and my lifetime over time. But we get spikes, and you could all day, you could talk about the causes. Sometimes, like Baltimore after the Freddie Gray incident, police officers refuse to do their job. And their argument is if we can't racially profile, go on hunches, be rough with people, then we're just not going to do our job and you can all kill each other. That to me is not a convincing argument. But other people, I think, and tell me if I'm right about this, my sense is that the majority of the Black community, the majority of America was open to the idea and is open to the idea of redefining policing. What kind of calls do police go to? How do we address our problems? Because I always felt cops were dumped on as the last resort for solving problems we can't solve in our society, like poverty, domestic violence, drug addiction. But I don't think the Black community was ever for getting rid of police. And I think that was not even a 15% position. So I really think the fundamental question we got to deal with is how are we going to police it? Because we always have to redefine policing based on new technology, new realities on the ground, things we've learned, whether it's what we've learned about how to deal with drug addiction, locking people up doesn't help that. So I think those are the big questions that if things can quiet down, maybe we can work together. For instance, Shafiq, you became a cop in New Haven as an activist against police misconduct, and you became on the front line of community policing, community cop, great respect from the community for ways you avoided violence and solved problems. And you were in a police union, and you were sympathetic to police rights. And what I'm wondering, Shafiq, is tell me if you have the same impression I did. When I started writing about community policing, when you started doing community policing, it was the conservative, old school white cops who said, we're not social workers. Cops are not social workers. Don't send us out to solve those problems. And people who want to reform said, we want cops to be trained differently with Yale Child Study, social workers, find ways other than arrest. Now the Black Lives Matter rallies were kind of agreeing, in my opinion, on that fundamental question with those same cops on the right. They don't agree about racism, and that's fundamental and that's important. But in terms of the nuts and bolts of how you do your job, I feel like the vanguard of the Black Lives Matter movement legitimately was soured on community policing. They didn't believe it could be reformed. They say cops shouldn't be social workers. And people who resisted Obama and the consent decrees and community policing in New Haven said cops aren't social workers. So if they agree, I wonder if they could come to the table and say cops will no longer respond to most domestic violence unless there's some kind of big potential violence. Will no longer, do most traffic work. I don't know. What do you think?
You know, I've always had that delicate balance, right? And you actually did remind me, about this is that before I actually became a police officer, I didn't even like the police. I mean, I talk about it in my book, A Black Man's Guide to Law Enforcement in America, which is now very disturbingly about 10 years old.
Wow.
And what I wrote it in 2009, actually it's over 10 years old because it's 2020, so it's about 11 years old. And the book is still relevant. And my now 20-year-old reminds me that, hey, the book is always going to be relevant because the situation for me, talking about him as a 20-year-old black man, he said, it hasn't changed from when you wrote the book. Now that's obviously sad, right? And that's obviously sad because some of the things that are in the book that talks about some of my experience and some of my experiences with what later became my own department, but my pre-experiences with the New Haven Police Department were not necessarily good ones. Unlike, maybe somebody else that comes on and everybody has their own experience. I didn't have the experience of the, police saving my dog or cat or rescuing somebody from the lake or something. They were all very negative and bad experiences. But I think that my activism, my commitment, my engagement with civic government, then at the time Mayor DeStefano and then Chief Nicholas Pastor, it was one of those, it was a challenge. And we talked about that at length. So, going inside as, a person with my views and holding the line, people say, oh, but you did it. But it's like, dude, you don't have no clue what it's like to go into a police department with the idea that you're going to try to change this thing from the inside. And you're dealing, with a lot of different things that you never experienced. And I went to predominantly white schools in a lot of places, but, being inside law enforcement is totally different. And sometimes it's no different for the black cop than it is for the white cop. But there's certainly at times there can be a historic difference for somebody like me. Okay, now, so with all of that, and traveling around the country and, consulting work for FBI, Homeland Security, and all the different places where I was brought in, this thing is, to me, I have to be honest, we're on some extraordinarily shaky ground right now with law enforcement. This is, law enforcement right now is kind of a lot like the stock. It's like the stock market. You got certain stocks that just based on the news, the stock will just go astronomically high. Has nothing to do with the actual company value. It has nothing to do with how much shares, that people value. It's just the news said this is about to be the next vaccine and the market goes boom. Or the news says, hey, you know what? Like the Wayfair thing, they're involved in, underground trafficking of children, and then the stock just went out of no. And it's kind of like policing right now. People are saying defund the police. People are saying do these different things, and then it kind of is like the police are just saying, well, you know what? I'm not going to get arrested. I don't know what's going on, and I'm not sure. But here's some of the things that I've been able to flesh out. And one is like, why do we keep coming back to the table for these discussions around police and black people and black men? Like, because you have to drill down on exactly what the exact problem is. Police,
wasn't it black women too? I mean, Breonna
it is black women, and so here's where it starts getting gray. If you say this is an issue between police and black men, and we have gender identity things going on, and we kind of have like a black movement of gender going on in the black community. So everybody's trying to. It's like the stock. Everybody's trying to sell their share. Get me in at $2, right? So what winds up happening is, okay, so now you have to add Sandra Bland. Now you have to add the other young lady that got shot. You have to. So now you're adding, but you're only adding maybe 5 or 6, right, or even a 1% to the overall of what the 100% problem is. The 100% problem is that 89 to 90% of these problems are exclusively black men, black males. And then you have some Hispanic males who come in a strong runner-up, right? And then you have black women coming in a third place, right? Like in a third place. So why is it happening? That's a question I kept asking people. Why is it happening? Why is it happening? It's happening, number one, because the entire perspective of policing in America right now is all wrapped around dealing with the war on drugs. Now, if you would have asked me this about 10 years ago, I would have said, go sit down, be quiet, leave me alone. But when you look at the way things are done, just in terms of motor vehicle stops, street stops of pedestrians, the inquiries that are done on a day-to-day basis, all these things are designed for the acquisition or the capturing of drugs, illegal drugs, and an illegal gun. So a lot of it has to do with training, and the training is what kind of breeds the culture. And what I feel really bad about for the basic officer, for that patrol officer, because that patrol officer is taught by somebody in upper level management who is taught by somebody from upper level management with a policy, and they're told us, hey, this is your job, you want to get paid, and this is what we're training you to do. So when you go out and you do a motor vehicle stop and I pull you over, Paul, and I say, you know what, license, registration, and insurance, and you say, why are you pulling me over, officer? And I look around and look at you in the face, and I take a quick sniff of your car, don't smell no weed. You don't look too suspicious. I don't know what suspicious is. It depends on the neighborhood you're in, right? If you're in a black neighborhood, then you look like a white dude buying drugs. But technically, you're Jewish, so you know what I mean. You know what I mean. So but anyway, and then I can look at you and you go, officer, and this is happening in 10 seconds. Why are you pulling me over? And I'm like, your emission sticker is expired. But I was driving behind you for 5 miles. So how the hell I know your emission sticker is expired? But it doesn't matter because it is expired. And you can't debate that, right? And if you want to debate that, then I'm going to go for your air freshener. Okay? You got an air freshener from Hanukkah. You got a Hanukkah air freshener, and it's hanging from the window. And dude, it's another ticket, right? You know what I'm saying? So here's the deal. You would say, wow, but I'm keeping the city safe, right? Because I pulled you over. Because if I didn't cite you for that expired admission sticker and that Hanukkah air freshener, man, I'm contributing to society. Now, the officers themselves are trained to do that. It is not yes.
You can't put air freshener on your window?
So technically, anything hanging from your rear view mirror is a violation.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good thing I don't smoke because I don't need the air freshener.
It would be considered obstruction of view, right? Well, here's the deal, right? So here's the deal. Here's the code breaker. The code breaker is a precursor to potentially pulling you out of the car or getting in the car or keeping you on the scene longer. So for all of the people out there, and some of my colleagues that might listen to this later down the road and say, oh, Shafiq told all the secrets. No, it's in the book 11 years ago. Here's the deal. The longer a police officer keeps you on the scene of a motor vehicle stop, you've got a problem happening, right? Because it's more stuff for me to think about. It's like when your mother walks into your bedroom early in the morning and she just starts walking around looking at stuff. You're like, Ma, what do you need? And she was like, oh, I don't, you're like, Ma, what do you need? She's like, well, I mean, what are you going to do with these dishes? You're like, Mom, get out of the room, right? Because the longer your mother stay in the room, you're going to have a problem. And if she sits on the bed, you're stuck, right? Something's going to go down. So it's the same thing with law enforcement. The longer that officer keeps you and they're running your plate, and that's how people normally know. For men, black men, and black, Hispanic, Latino women and white women who are in the car with black men when they get pulled over, you know when it takes a long time for that officer to get back, what do people start doing? They start doing this. And they start doing that. Why? Because they're starting to see what's going on. Are more police coming? Or am I in trouble? Because the longer you're in the scene. So here's the deal. What am I talking about? Shafiq, yes. So somebody says, well, Shafiq, what are you talking about, Shafiq? If the law is the law, if it's expired, the officer has a right. If the plate is done, and I agree. So here's what I did. I got a hold of an old Connecticut infraction, motor vehicle infraction book. It has all of the fines, right? All the fines. Running a stoplight, your emission sticker expired, not wearing a seat belt. So it's all of the stuff that when you get a ticket and they write out the ticket and they give it to you, it is that particular book. I counted approximately 445 infractionable charges. So these are like 445 reasons that if you're operating a motor vehicle, you could be cited for, written a ticket. That was roughly from 2015. Could not get a hold of the newer one, but I'm going to work on it. And they normally go up. They never really take laws off that motor vehicle book. So let's just say this. Let's just say, as of right now, there's approximately 500 reasons that a police officer in the state of Connecticut can pull you over, right? In a majority of those, and I'll be working on numbers for the next show, but like 75% of them are equipment violations. They've got nothing to do with you almost ran over a 1-year-old because you was driving too fast, right? It's got nothing to do with you popped a wheelie with your old duster and had it on. No, these are things like your tail light is out, your front headlight is out. Listen, we've got cars in America now that have recalls. You could be driving around and out of nowhere because you turned on your signal. The recall was that when you turn on your signal, your back tail light goes out. So if an officer pulling you over because your back tail light is out, how the hell you know your back tail light is out? And then you go home and find out that you got a notice from Ford and they said, hey, listen, we got a recall on the tail light. Officers should not have to, that's what I should say. They should not be charged with enforcing equipment violations.
Okay, so Shafiq, I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking of something more fundamental. So if they want to get you, they're going to get you. They got 500 violations, and if none of that works, there's a thing called interfering, which is legal code for, I just want to arrest you because I'm pissed at you, so I'm going to charge you with interfering. Right. So fundamentally, how are we going to have just policing if that kind of stopping can go on? Now, when you talk to police, right, because you are a police officer, retired, we always hear a good cop is proactive. So that means they can kind of sense something's off. And sometimes it is racial, like what's that white guy doing in this black neighborhood? But obviously it can be profiling and based on bias. But the cops who often get the illegal guns off the street have made just that kind of stop where they're looking for a pretext. And so the cops saying, if you don't let us make these stops a pretext, you're not going to get the guns off the street and the dangerous people off.
That's correct.
But the rest of society is saying, how is it fair for tens of millions of Americans to have to be at risk of just being stopped on a pretext, jammed up, maybe killed for no reason because they're black and driving a car? And so I don't see how you could fundamentally ever address the issue by having someone get, I mean, obviously you wrote the book, Black Man's Guide to America. So it's very important that people know how to stop a police stop from escalating into death or arresting.
That's right. That's correct.
But for us as America altogether, dealing with police injustice or social injustice, and cops too, wanting to be able to do their job without being hated by the community, we really got to change that paradigm, right? We got to say, we don't want you just getting stopped and have them looking for something like mom in the room in the morning.
Right. So here was my suggestion, and this was my task force suggestion in my conversations with some of the senators, is that in the state of Connecticut, let's just take those laws right off the book. There's no need for a police officer there's no functionality in society for a police officer to stop a person because their back tail light is out, because their admission sticker is out. Even if you do stop somebody because their admission sticker is off, that's a state licensing issue. That's a state regulation
But
issue.
Shafiq, if you get rid of 499 and they can still stop you for one reason, they're still good. If the training is still stop them if you're suspicious and find a reason. Then if they're looking fidgety, I've read those reports. He looked around
Right,
and
right,
he's
right,
suspicious.
right.
I wonder if there's a more fundamental need
Well,
to
I think that
change
part
on
of
how one goes about policing a community.
so understand how the motor vehicle works in tandem, right? So I was a police commander for a district or a district commander. So I'm watching TV recently. There's Charles Ramsey, their former police commissioner for, I believe, one of the large states, Chicago, city of Chicago. There's Bill Bratton. He's up there, right, from New York, former New York person. And these are leading figures inside of law enforcement. When I was a district commander, we were subject to what you know as ComStat. You've been there thousands of times, right? Before it was ComStat, it was TASCA, right? It came out of New York and it was TASCA. ComStat is just TASCA renamed, right? But the bottom line is all professional policing all across the United States of America through agencies such as the International Police Chiefs Association and PERF and others follow this standard of TASCA and ComStat. So what is TASCA ComStat? You've been there. I've been there. I get up and I say, hey, I'm Shafiq Abdussabur, and they say, show me your numbers for the week. Okay, my motor vehicles stops in my district. Oh, they're low. They were down 20%. You got to get those numbers up. What else? Oh, such as those were low. Those are pedestrian stops. You got to get those numbers up. What are your arrests? Your arrests. What are your gun numbers? Are your gun? So here's my point. The concept of policing right now in America is driven off of this level of engagement and things like equipment violation enforcement only becomes an operating tool to get to that. So what you're saying is exactly right, Paul. And I just kind of like backed into it slowly. The reality is that the people at the top, the police chiefs, the commanders, the commissioners, the people that run PERF, the people that are in charge of the International Police Chief Association, these people have got to say, wait a minute, we're doing this backwards, right? As long as we keep making it where if you're a district commander and your motor vehicle numbers are low, and as a result of that, your shootings were up, and you got to get your motor vehicles up and stop this and do this, then you're going to continue to drive the police. The police are like the horses on a wagon. They're like the horses on a covered wagon. If you ever watched the Western, the horses on the covered wagon, they just be rock and the horses be going and the people be on the wagon until they're under threat. And when they're under threat, what do? They slam on the horses and they make the horses do what they need to be done for their situation. So, I've been saying this for years and I still believe this. The police are not the officer, the patrol officer is not the driver. They're the wheel on the car. We have to go back and ask us what kind of car did we make and where are we going with this vehicle? And I'm saying that, and I said this yesterday in our meeting, our state meeting, is that, we can make policies for days. They've been making policies in America, for policing. I'm hearing now they say, well, we're going to put together best practices again, and we're going to make this new best practice. Listen, I was policed under almost every best practice that there was to be had. And we still wound up in this position, right? We still wind up 20 years later. Boy, you know this. You did the article. I was trying to find it. I'll try it for next show. But remember when you worked for the Advocate and you did the article on community policing under the COPS grant? They released all the money and you did a whole series to show all the suburban towns that took the money and improved their SWAT teams. They brought all SWAT gear. Remember that? They was buying dogs and helmets and shotguns and rifles but New Haven took their money and they upgraded their mobile data terminals and a lot of their IT, right? That's because the grant itself, it allowed that. So what was interesting is that all the suburban towns, I think you referred to it as, they used it to buy toys, right? They use it to buy toys. So, all right, Paul, let me tell them about what they're listening to, where they can go, and how they can listen. So, if you're just joining us today on Urban Talk Radio, I'm your host, Shafiq Abdussabur, and we are talking about police and politics today, and really just where we are in the state of politics, not just in Connecticut, but around the country. We know that New Haven has been one of the leading agencies in the country for community policing, literally for the last probably almost over 2 decades. I have on with me today, which is my special guest, Paul Bass, and Paul Bass has been in my opinion, one of the top editors and reporters on community policing. He has spent most of all his career doing this. So if you want to join this show, you can log on to newhavenindependent.org, or you can join our conversation on this Zoom. So go ahead, Paul. So yeah, so what I'm saying, Paul, is that this new law is going to go in effect. I think in about another year or so. And, it's going to say, hey, no more qualified immunity. Cops are going to freak out about that. So there's going to have to be some groundwork that's done on that. But in the meantime, there's going to be all these different, as I said, some folks are working on best practices and a few other things. And here's the other part too. Here's a scary, scary part. You know, because you're Jewish, imagine a group of pork farmers, right? And barbecue experts getting around talking about how they're going to make you a kosher hamburger because you keep getting sick from eating, you know what I mean? Like, here we go again. It's like, I feel like DMX say, here we go again. So now we've got this big need on police reform. We got Black Lives Matter. The pressure's on. And rooms are being made and tables are being set outside of different places. And it is white folks, white police chiefs, people who are elites that are not on the ground, that don't have an idea what's going on. Some of them don't even have law enforcement backgrounds. And they're going to sit in a room and they're going to come up with a solution on how they're going to get policing to go in a different direction. And unfortunately, this is kind of the menu that gets replayed throughout the entire country. You go to agencies like PERF, it's all white faces. There's no black police chiefs really involved in that. I think Chief Charles Ramsey is like one of the only few in those groups. So we're not going to get to what we think we're going to get when folks sit around and make a policy or a law and say, okay, this is what it's going to be, and then it make its way down to patrol. If we don't really dig into this thing this time for real and just be real about it, right? We don't need police chasing stolen cars. They're insured. Why are they chasing a car that you literally can get money? In fact, if the car gets stolen and you don't get it back, if it's insured, you're better off anyways, right? It's like you can say, but why are we doing this? Because we want the car? When you do the numbers don't make sense. But when you train the cops, they're trained to do that. Because when they go to the lineup, they're given a sheet of paper. It's called a hot sheet, and it has a list of all of the stolen cars. And they're handed that. Here you go. When you go out the day, look for those cars. Why? Because if I recover those stolen cars from my commander or the person I'm dealing with, those get to go to the numbers. So we just got to change what the expectation is for the officers. If officers, this is what I know from officers, if you could have officers on a system where you tell them, hey, when you go out today, make sure you meet 30 new people in this neighborhood. And how many book bags did you guys pass out for? They'll do it. If they're trained to do that, that's what they will do. If that's where the focus of policing goes, that's where they will do it. But if you don't do that, then they're just going to be doing what they're doing, and it's really easy because now, you know, this is no longer about changing policy. And I don't really like these terms, but I'm like I get sucked into them. Generational trauma. I really don't like that thing. I hate that, right? But here's the deal. You're now into generational policing, where their grandfather policed this way, the father policed this way, now the son or the daughter is policing. So this is something that in those families it kind of stays true. In a I think they call it a Superman syndrome. Whether I'm black, white, Hispanic, because I really big about this. Just because you black and you a cop, don't absolve them from the bias, right? Because if I'm black from a good neighborhood and very elite background, I don't have I can't identify with Pookie and Snoopy. I'm here to help you, okay? And if you're lucky, right? So, it's this Superman syndrome. Like Christopher Columbus. I'm here to, what do we say? We want here to make the natives, the savages, So, I mean, these are some of the things that have to be removed. And they're not going to be removed through community meetings. It's almost as if Connecticut, and here's my goal, has to break away from these national models. And Connecticut has to develop a policing style and concept for the state of Connecticut. We can't rely on sending our officers to a conference in Los Angeles with 95% white male instructors who have no clue on what's really going on in America, so our people can come back with a piece of paper and say, I'm a certified law enforcement police professional. We need to, for the state of Connecticut, look at how do the people in Connecticut want to be policed? What does it take for that to happen? What are our ideas of safety in America, right? Because some of people will tell you in the black community, having more police do not make them feel safe, and then you go into some white neighborhoods and, they say, hey, listen, I like to see a police officer because it makes, so we need to come up with what is safety for different people. What does that take? And I think we can come up with a tailor-made solution, to law enforcement. And I know that was
I
long,
might use
Paul,
the
but
phrases peace officers and then police officers, guardians instead of warriors. I listened to you.
yeah, I heard that one.
I'm looking at the bill's provisions, and I don't want to downplay the importance of the work being done in the legislature and last night's votes. I don't want to downplay the concerns of police officers about how am I supposed to do my job because they're not being shown, as you said, alternatives to these stops, the car stops. I still feel like you've identified the more fundamental issue. Because, for instance, we fought a lot about whether you can sue cops in state court. That's important. That got all the drama, hours, really raised more fundamental questions about what we want police to be. In the end, I'd be surprised if you find 2 cops sued under the state law meaningfully in the next 2 years. I'm not talking about an initial thing that gets thrown out. It is so hard to, first of all, sue and then win a judgment. That is, while I agree with what they did last night with this law and it's positive, this is not going to affect 99% of the interactions, 99.9% of the interactions between police and community. And it's not going to, last night, all this stuff is important. Mental health assessments, independent investigations, that's all important. I think you're talking about the fundamental role of police, fundamental interactions between police and community. And I really believe that the debate we've had loses the nuances of what I really believe this. Maybe it's too kumbaya. I think the vast majority of citizens of all races and the vast majority of cops of all political viewpoints, you put them in a room for an hour, it's going to be amazing how much they agree about cops can and can't do, what expectations are. And I think it's about when you said you want your officers to make 30 contacts with neighbors in a day. It's just from talking to each other and seeing each other. I do fundamentally believe that, Shafiq. I do fundamentally believe people are good. I do fundamentally believe the system is rigged against cops and community, and not out of anyone's. I mean, yes, there is some history of definite racism and roots in policing about post-slavery keeping African Americans under control, especially in Oakland, and that's why the rise of Black Panthers. But I also believe there's just some fundamental issues in society that we've dumped on policing, and it doesn't work for anybody. And I would just love when the smoke clears to see a real getting together. I'm thinking of you because you were in your police career. You walked in every room in the community and department. You were in the union. And I was thinking back, Shafiq, a few years ago, something that we'd be amazed today. It was this controversial. A white cop had a 15-year-old black girl in handcuffs who had caused the scene in a wings place. Handcuffs, nothing in her hand. Throws her to the ground, sidewalk so hard she gets a concussion. Police find in her pocket a little knife as though that somehow justified that you needed to give her a concussion, send her to the hospital. The mayor, the police chief, they decided they didn't punish the police officer. They just said, let's put him on the desk, paid for a few days while we look at this because this might not be the outcome we want. Police erupted in such outrage that he'd even be questioned for this. That when there was a police and mayor press conference at City Hall, the police union stormed in, disrupted the press conference, did not let it go on, and yelled for the mayor and the police chief to be fired because they dared to question about whether it was a good outcome to have a white officer throw a 15-year-old black girl handcuffed onto the pavement so hard she gets a concussion. You were in the union at that time, Shafiq. I think you were even an official of the union.
Yeah, I was.
What was that like for you? What did you think about that, and how do you look back at that moment?
So, to be honest with you, that was one of those it was a political situation, and it actually, I'm gonna call it what I'm gonna call it. I mean, it was bad upper police management, and what wound up happening, what triggered those officers to do that, and I'll never forget this, was that the chief had spent the balance of his day in the department. And he was going around telling officers that he was not going to be bullied by City Hall, that he was going to let this go through the process, that he had laid out that what he was going to do. He was going to do an inquiry. He was going to do internal affairs investigation. He was not going to let it be influenced by the media or anything like that. So he went to all the officers all throughout the department. If you understand, when a chief is walking throughout the department doing that, that's a big thing. There was 2 lineups. That's when police officers come right before they go to work. They got to stand at attention and they get told what to do. The 3 o'clock lineup, he came down. I shook his hand. He said, no, this is what I'm going to do. And I said, okay, I'm going to keep talking to the community. He did the lineup, told them he's not a politician. He's not going to be moved by the politics. 4 o'clock, I stayed because I wanted to see if he was going to say the same thing. Because I knew the protest was building. The protesters, only a handful of them, but they was going to be going to City Hall. So I want to see how this played out because I'm learning. I'm always in a learning phase. And at like 10 minutes to 4, he got up there and he get ready to give the presentation at 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, he gave the presentation. And I was off, so I couldn't help myself. I got in my car. I drove across Church Street, right over the overpass. As I drove over the overpass, some people that I knew who were key protesters that would have been in front of City Hall was passing me. And as they passed me, because I didn't really want to talk to them, they looked at me and smiled like I'm smiling at you now. And a notification came over my phone from your newspaper saying, mayor puts cop on desk duty. I said, oh man, all hell's gonna break loose. By the time I drove to City Hall, which was like 2 minutes, they had already been in the mayor's office and tried to hold her, basically politically hostage on the thing. And she, at that time, made that decision. But at the same time, it was like she was making that decision. The chief was pledging that it was not gonna happen. And cops are smart. So what they do is, they do their own homework and go, wait a minute. He was up here telling us this, getting us to confide in him and trust him. And all along, this was happening. So it looked like they had been double crossed.
Can I tell you how I remember it a little bit differently?
Let's go.
So when the incident took place, it was St. Patrick's Day, and the chief was in France. And there were 3 assistant chiefs here.
That was the actual incident. I'm talking about the aftermath. I'm
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about
And
when the
in the aftermath, for days, he was in France.
That's correct.
And the assistant chiefs, there was a demonstration at the police station. And
I
the
was
assistant
there.
chiefs hid inside for hours and wouldn't go out. So they
I
sent
was
someone who's
there.
now the assistant chief, but was only one of 10 district managers, then Herb Sharp, with you
Yes, that's true.
outside to talk to protesters because everybody else hid. And Herb did okay.
Yes, he did.
And then the chief, I was at the home of the 15-year-old girl when the chief got back into town and brought in two assistant chiefs with him and went to the home and said something I thought, why did it take days to say? Which was, we don't want this result. Whether or not the cop did anything wrong, we don't want the result that a 15-year-old girl who's upset, who's in handcuffs, is not posing a threat, is slammed so hard to the ground she gets a concussion. There was never like a sorry. He said, I'm sorry it happened. And the family cried and talked about how the girl was suicidal. And there was a fundamental issue that needed to be addressed. So I thought for days it took us to get to that point where, despite we started in 1990 with community policing, this was 25 years later.
That's right.
We're still at a point where the police union would not entertain a discussion that says whether or not the police officer did anything wrong. Right. We don't want a result where it ends, where you're throwing a 15-year-old handcuffed girl to the ground, she gets a concussion. We don't think that's a good ending. And we weren't still able to talk about that. Right. And I felt like it was a deeply racist and unaccountable march to City Hall when they disrupted that meeting. Because I don't think standing by your cops means when you have a tough incident, you're still going to be paid, you're still going to work, but we're going to take you off the street for a few days and look into it and see how we can do it better. That isn't even beginning. They say they don't want lawsuits. They don't want to be questioned.
Right. So I think
felt that you could see the video still if you look it up.
Yeah, no, I
you could see the video of that march. I believe that was a racist, unaccountable police march. That doesn't mean I think most cops are racist. Doesn't mean I think cops are wrong about some of the fundamental concerns about the problems we're dumping on them. But to me, that was the moment that showed that even in the city that did community policing pretty much right by saying we don't want more arrests, we want to work with other people to prevent crime. Even here, we fundamentally couldn't talk about outcomes we don't want because you're not even allowed to question or hold accountable. That officer was never disciplined, and it was as though the police were so wronged because a bad outcome was even examined about how we could do it better. That's how I saw it differently from the outside, Shafiq.
Listen, that is interesting. I will tell you that part of the insides. I will tell you that I think I can tell you this now. You know, part of the antithesis of the march wasn't even really about the officer. It was about the contract. The contract, if I'm not mistaken, was either about to be up or it was up. There were some other things that had happened at that time with the mayor that, some commitments were made around the police with contracts that were not kept. And so the police officers was very upset. I mean, I'll be honest with you. The union before the mayor had got in had endorsed the mayor. And that was part of, them trying to get a better contract. And then once the mayor got in, they felt like she turned her back on them because she did not follow through with some of the commitments of the contract. So they were furious about the contract, to be honest with you. The officer's job was that was a technicality. They have lawyers and plenty of money to handle that.
And he wasn't disciplined. He didn't lose a cent.
Here's the deal. Here's the deal. Don't put that on the police union. That's the police chief's move. You follow what I'm saying?
No, but even him doing that little bit, the police union's presentation to the public was that if we prefer in our city not to have handcuffed 15-year-old black girls slammed to the ground by a bunch of cops and get a concussion, that's not our ideal outcome when there's a dispute at a restaurant. If a police chief is even to say, I'm not disciplining him, I just want to look at him, put him on the desk and pay him for a few days, the police union isn't even going to stand for that. That is defined as anti-cop. How is the community supposed to view police at that point?
Yeah, listen, I am not going to, even years later, I can't make an excuse for that. What I can tell you is the technical components of that. And the technical components of that was people wanted the officer fired. People wanted the officer disciplined. But the problem was you can only discipline an officer. So here's the deal. You can discipline an officer for anything at any given time you want. Whether or not the discipline will stand is another thing. So here's the deal. The chief could have came out and said, I'm going to suspend the officer. I'm going to take him off the street. I'm going to do these things. But in the end, he was going to take a hit. And the reason was because the officer was trained to do that particular move. The problem was, and this is a problem, this is a fundamental problem that New Haven has suffered with, and many departments do for years. When the hiring is low and there's a rush to hire people, you get somebody in one academy on one side of the state, somebody on academy on another side of the state, and somebody in your in-house academy. So now what you've got is people being trained in one area 3 different ways. Then you bring them all back together again, and then this happens. And then it's like, oh my God, that looks horrible. And it does look horrible. It's like, damn. Like, when you see that, right? And you go, who would have taught you that, right? But if you were taught that, and it's written down that you were taught that, and it's sanctioned, remember all of the policymakers are making these policies saying it's okay, right? When you get disciplined, you're going to get the time back. If you get fired, you're going to get your job back. And on that end, with this particular situation, it was such a political hotcake. The chief didn't want to take a hit. The mayor really didn't want to take a hit.
The chief tried to do what you said. He said, because this officer was trained to post. He wasn't trained in New Haven. He says, we don't train. This was a training issue. But the rank and file, and I heard it. I got the comments. I got the phone calls. They all took this as that it doesn't matter who's trained that way. He did the right thing. We're going to continue doing this. You're not allowed to question it.
That was the pile.
So the outcome in the end was we're going to continue to throw you 15-year-old girls on the ground. You're going to break your head. We're going to do what we want. You can't question us.
Yeah,
that's a problem, Shafiq.
And that is, obviously that is a problem. And that, I think that is the fine line that we're going to be in law enforcement for a while. And the fine line comes down to, we know that type of personality exists in law enforcement. It exists in a lot of different professions. This is why we have to make sure we have the right people leading police departments. And we've got to make sure that we've got the right supervisors. We've got to make sure that we've got the right people in union position so that we can try to keep the lid on these things, right? Is racism, bias, bigotry, and domination, all of these things are not going to be fixed with a policy and a law. But they can be fixed by making sure that people that are in those spaces that have the power to make a difference are able and have the courage to do that. And it's going to take some time. It's just going to take a while for us to do this. And I think we're getting there. Hey, Paul. Oh, wow. It's that time, right? So, Paul, listen, man, thank you for being on the show with me today. I really appreciate it. You're one of the best guys that I would like to have this discussion with. And if you're just joining us today on Urban Talk Radio 103.5 FM WNHHLP, I'm your host, Shafiq Abdussabur. Today we were talking about police and politics, and we don't have the answers to all of the questions. But if you miss any part of this show or broadcast or podcast, you can log on to newhavenindependent.org. It's been very hot. Make sure you drink water, stay hydrated. Remember, in closing, make their space a better place. All right, Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Shafiq. It was an honor.
Thank you, Harry.
Hi, this is Babs Rawls-Ivy from New Haven, Connecticut, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM, streaming live at newhavenindependent.org.